So even though I recently said in the previous video that the easiest way to betray the Bible is to fragment it, now I'm going to just look at a couple of little verses from Romans 1. But the reason I'm doing that is because, this course is not a course on Romans, and I could spend, if I really wanted to go through the text carefully, it would take the entire course to go through just the book of Romans. So I'm going to pick a couple of verses here to kind of try to make some connections between this text and our course on ecclesiology. So Romans 5:1 says, through whom we've received grace or gift, is another way of translating the word charis there, and apostleship to bring about the obedience of faithfulness among all the nations for the sake of his name. So if you are familiar with the book of Romans, you've already noticed a difference here, a shocking difference. Paul... Faith is often understood as the opposite of obedience, right? So if we were to read this the way it's normally translated into English as the obedience of faith, faith and obedience, this whole James works righteousness, or works faith, and this Paul belief faith, we have a problem. Faith is the opposite of obedience. It's not something that it's not something that Paul emphasizes. Works is not something that Paul emphasizes, right? So it's odd that he puts these two together here. But this is why the translation matters. Because we might read Paul as if he's just proclaiming a cheap grace, and that's wrong. Paul doesn't do that, period. Hard stop, right? So it'll help us understand what Paul's getting at if we change faith to faithfulness or to loyalty. The loyalty in recent American politics has gotten a bit of some baggage associated with it. So we tend to confuse faith with believing certain things. I don't think Paul's interested in that. He's interested in loyalty. He's interested in adherence. Adherence to someone has to do with sticking with that one, with an unswerving loyalty to that one, even to the extent that we can see this as the obedience of a slave to their master. That type of adherence, that type of faithfulness. And Paul understands himself to be commissioned to bring about the obedience of faithfulness among all the nations. That's what Gentiles, the other word that usually shows up there, means. It means the nations, all the people who are not from Judea. It's a political term. But remember how tiny this movement is. So if you are pastoring a small church or are part of a small church, and all our churches are getting smaller these days, think of how small and tiny Paul's original movement was. It's not spreading like wildfire. He spends 3 years in Ephesus. If you read the book of Acts, he spends 3 years in Ephesus. And when he leaves, he's converted maybe 20 or 30 people, tops. This is not 3,000 in one day. This is 20 or 30 people after 3 years. But this obedience of faithfulness is critical to getting this whole process moving, to getting this whole thing moving. Then we get to Romans 1:8. I thank my God through Jesus Messiah for all of you, because your faithfulness is proclaimed throughout the world. And so this role of thanksgiving or gratitude is really fascinating in Paul, and I'm just not going to have time to get into it, but I couldn't resist dropping a nugget here. It's pivotal for our relationship with God. That's what a gospel is for, so that people give thanks. They say thank you. Gospel is not something you get and you say, oh darn, right? If you read further in Romans 1, it sounds like you could read Romans 1 as saying all the bad things that happened toward the end of Romans 1 happened because people forgot to say thank you. Which I said, again, we don't have time to get to, so I'm just going to tease that little plug there. Romans 1:16-17. For I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God for salvation to everyone who's loyal, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it the justice of God is revealed through faithfulness for faithfulness. As it is written, the one who is just will live by faithfulness. So, normally in English we read the righteousness of God here, but almost every other language translates this as justice, because English is one of the few languages that has a different word for justice that is righteousness, right? Most Spanish doesn't have a word for righteousness. So if you read the gospel in Spanish, it's all about justice, that God's interested in justice. That's a very different idea. We think of justice as something out here amongst us, amongst people, in the midst of politics. We think of righteousness as like this moral thing, this private morality between me and my God, internal, and not having much to do with you at all, right? As long as I don't say bad words, we're all good. So why would Paul say, first of all, that he's not ashamed of the gospel? Let's back up. This presupposes that one might think that they should be ashamed or embarrassed by the gospel, like the gospel is weird. You're going to try to claim something important about someone who was executed in a community in which you live. Someone walks around claiming to be the Messiah that you know, that you grew up with, and they're executed in the community you live. You're going to be ashamed of them, right? That's what was going on when Paul was writing. And so Paul's saying this gospel, this weird thing that we're proclaiming, it's not weakness. In fact, it's power. It's divine power for salvation. Now, salvation wasn't a religious term when Paul used it. He didn't make up the word or find it in this religious lexicon somewhere. The emperors of Rome called themselves saviors. It was one of their titles. So salvation is a political term. Salvation is what happens when you avert famines, when you defeat your enemies, those sorts of things. And Paul says this gospel is the power of God for the salvation of everyone who is faithful and loyal. And when Paul's readers would have heard it, they would have heard those political overtones. And then we get to the justice of God. Something about the gospel is also what discloses divine justice, God's justice. It manifests divine justice. Now, you might not say this is good news. The real divine justice is, in spite of all appearances, though, something that should make folk glad. It's different from what you might expect. So how is it that the justice of God is a glad-making possibility, a gospel thing? Gospel means glad-making, right? Well, it doesn't take much wakefulness to look around the world and realize that justice is having a hard time in our world. And we yearn for something different. And so Paul is addressing people who, in spite of everything, would really like and hope for justice to happen. Maybe like the people in Chile from Kavanaugh's text would hope for justice in their situation. Maybe like the men of Bart's depressed village would hope for something like justice there. And maybe like we in America today would hope for something like justice here. For Paul, justice really is possible. It really can be. And that's because of something that has happened to turn things around. That thing that has happened was the fate of the Messiah Jesus. And whatever it was that happened through the history of the Messiah is the justice of God, which is what people are hoping for, what they're looking for. It's why we should rejoice and be glad. It's why we should give thanks. And so this is the statement of Paul's thesis. The gospel discloses the justice of God. And that is the power of God that will save everybody. And what's the role of the church in that for our course? What's the role of the church in that? The whole Roman Empire was about justice. It was their brand. It's what it was. It's what they did. It's who they were. The Roman Empire brought law and order. And that's what justice was for Rome. It was its reason for being. Rome's gift to the world was the law. The law as the law of justice. Now, Judaism, the Judeans had their own law, their own brand of justice, right? Their own gift to the world. And Paul is wanting to claim a different key for justice, a different register for justice. It's not found in Roman or Judean law. Both of those laws rightly, justly, according to those laws, condemned and executed the Messiah. Just because something's legal doesn't mean it's just. But in this case, they rightly, legally executed and condemned the Messiah. If justice is going to come from somewhere, it can't come from human society, human laws. It has to come from somewhere else. So God's justice is coming, and by that justice, all of us are going to be saved. Society, the world, is going to be saved. It's going to create a decent kingdom where all people can thrive and where justice flourishes. God's justice, which is going to somehow come to expression by means of this gospel of God concerning Jesus Messiah, his Son. What is it that will awaken or provoke the loyalty, the faithfulness that will make people, that will make the world just? Is it getting our guy or our gal elected into the office? Getting our legislation or policy passed? Or is that approach going back to the Roman approach? Salvation by law. I mean, the Roman Empire approach. Salvation by law. Salvation by military. Salvation by the empire. How does that relate to the message of the one who was executed in the name of justice, in the name of the law? Paul's proposing a paradox. It's going to be a lot clearer. Reading Romans is going to be a lot clearer if we keep in mind that he's really interested in justice and he's talking about justice. So there's a lot more that can be said about Romans 1 here, but I've taken 11 minutes already. There's a lot I'm really agonizing over not covering. You can read Ted Jennings' books. I'm reading Dared Out Thinking Paul and Outlaw Justice, the Messianic Politics of Paul, to go a lot deeper into these texts and some of Jennings' other works as well. For now, though, we're going to sign off from our reading of Romans for the week.